Hi, welcome to the Midtown Vineyard Podcast. We're so glad you've joined us online. For daily encouragement, events, service times, and more, check out our website and social media. And now, this week's message.
Amen. There's so many good things to celebrate that we almost lost track. Can we celebrate one more time? I just think between baptism and just New Life Sunday and the back parking lot. So there's something that I don't know if you've had this experience before, but things that cause you to stop and stare. Like maybe when you're out in the grocery store and you see a child acting like a child, and then the parent begins acting like a child because the parent wants the child to stop acting like a child. And this whole thing starts like it's like a reaction, but then it becomes an overreaction. And I don't know if you know much about overreactions, but we can see those. And there's something inside of us that knows this is weird. Like, we don't know whether or not to hide our faces or get our phone out and begin filming. Like we're not exactly sure what to do in those moments, right? If your parents were overreactors, you remember this feeling. Like it might be what led to you wanting to get away from that right away, or maybe you've been through like processing that over years, or on the flip side, we've all had those moments where we've overreacted. I don't know if I'm the only one in the room where you just feel like there's something that triggers you, and that reaction that you had wasn't the one that was maybe the equal one, right? It kind of overflowed and it was an overreaction. And then maybe you've had this experience before where you end up apologizing for your overreaction even though you were right. But what you were right about was handled wrongly, and so you end up apologizing for the thing you were right about because you were right about it in the wrong way. And those overreactions can kind of give us away. You've heard it said before that actions speak louder than words. And I think that as I think about that, I'm like, that's true. But what I think might also be true is that our reactions speak louder than words. Our reactions reveal kind of what's going on inside of us, what we are fearful of, where our hope is, or where our faith is. And where we're going this morning is, what if there was a way to harness the power of a reaction? What if there was a way to harness an overreaction for something good? And the scriptures today show us that there is a way. And as we're going to discover, this is just sort of fundamental Jesus following. This is just sort of 101. This is not extra credit Christianity. This is what it looks like and what it sounds like when we live following Jesus. It changes the way we react. Nehemiah is going to show us. Nehemiah is going to insist that we master the art of the unexpected, unprecedented underreaction, which is a word that I'm choosing on purpose. It's sort of an overreaction, but in the opposite direction, right? It's when something doesn't get us all worked up when maybe it should have. It's something that makes people look at us and see our underreaction and kind of go, man, what's making him not react? What's up with her? How can they handle this, right? Nehemiah consistently viewed in the scriptures and in this passage that we're going to look at today, he was constantly moving people by his underreaction to the elements of things that were going around him. Like the things that were causing chaos in his life, he just had this sort of peace about it. And I think if we stare at this for just a moment, we're going to see that we are called to the same thing. So if you have your Bibles, open up to Nehemiah chapter 4. Many of you may remember as you turn there, you may want to use your table of contents to get there. It's a small book of the Bible and it's kind of tucked away in the Old Testament. As you're getting there, you may remember several weeks back, we began a study of the book of Nehemiah. We began this study because we said sometimes there's these walls in our lives that need to be rebuilt. We go through things, we go through seasons where God cleanses us or purges us, and we're called to start a chapter over again. And so as we start over, as we rebuild, what can we learn from a rebuild in the Old Testament? And so we focused in on the story of Nehemiah. Nehemiah's story starts 400 years BC, 400 years before Jesus. Nehemiah was a cupbearer to the emperor of Persia living in the palace there. And he's a Jewish cupbearer. He hears that the Jews who have moved back to Jerusalem are having trouble rebuilding the city wall there. And this is awful. If you don't have a wall around your city, you can be plundered. If you don't have a wall around your city, you could be embarrassed. Most of the time, this was an insult to you. And they're trying to rebuild this wall, and they can't seem to get it done. And it so wrecks Nehemiah, living all the way back in Persia, that he can't stop thinking about it. And so he goes to the emperor, takes great risk at his own life, and says, Emperor, could I please move back to Jerusalem? Could I please move back to Israel and help with the rebuild there? And he gets permission. And so we asked in the first week of this study, we said, what is the wall in your life that you've been called to rebuild? What is it that you dare not come down from until it's done? What is the great work in your life that you know God has called you to work on? And then the second week of it, we asked, what breaks your heart? Because Nehemiah was so broken and so moved by hearing this news of his ancestors and his relatives back in Israel that he had to go there and be a part of the rebuild, right? And in week 3, we said we had to examine the walls of our lives to see what it was that we needed help rebuilding. And then this morning, we're going to see what happens when there's detractors. What happens when there's opposition? See, Nehemiah has started rebuilding the wall. He started organizing the people to rebuild the wall. And while this is happening, he starts getting heckled. He starts being opposed. He starts being insulted. And he starts having to learn how to react to this going on around him. And his reaction or his underreaction may reveal to us how we could all be a bit more like Nehemiah. So I've bought you plenty of time to turn there. Nehemiah chapter 4, verse 1 says, when Sanballat, pause. Sanballat, we've met before. Sanballat is the leader of the opposition. Sanballat is the enemy of Israel. He does not want them to rebuild this wall, and he's been heckling them from day one. When Sanballat heard that we were rebuilding the wall, circle, underline, highlight, we said this is a diary entry. This is a journal. This is history. Nehemiah is keeping track of his experiences for us. When Sanballat heard that we were rebuilding the wall, he became angry and was greatly incensed. Some of your translations might have different words there. The ancient Hebrew here, the word for angry and greatly distressed, is more akin to hot. Like it's almost a double word where it says he was furious. He was indignant. When Sanballat and Tobiah first heard a couple of chapters ago that a man named Nehemiah had moved to Jerusalem, they were deeply disturbed, is what the language there says. Later, about a chapter later, they use scorn and they use intimidation to try to stop the work on the wall. They don't want this to be rebuilt. If Israel rebuilds her wall, then the plunderers, which Sanballat and Tobiah represent, the plunderers will not be able to plunder anymore. And every time Israel begins to rebuild in the past, all it takes is a little bit of intimidation from Sanballat and Tobiah, and it shuts the work down. But this time, they use scorn, they use intimidation, and nothing seems to work because Nehemiah is still going strong. And now in chapter 4, now the work has begun. And at this point, they're not just intimidating the workers. Oh no, Nehemiah says they are furious. They are indignant. They are hot. So when Sanballat heard that we were rebuilding the wall, he became angry. He was greatly incensed, and so he ridiculed the Jews. The nature of their discouraging attack, they use this mocking, sarcastic tone. Listen to what they say in verse 2. In the presence of his associates in the army of Samaria, he said, what are these feeble Jews doing? Will they restore their wall? Will they offer sacrifices? Will they finish in a day? Can they bring the stones back to life from those heaps of rubble, burned as they are? This has the idea of it that will they seek God through sacrifice and expect God to come down and build this wall for them? Will they pray this wall into existence? They're mocking them, ridiculing them, insulting them. Are they going to complete it in a day? This has the idea. Do they have any idea what they're taking on? Do they even know what they're doing? This is a big deal, right? This is a big work. They have no idea what they're doing. It's huge. And they don't know what they're in for. And isn't it true? This attack has a little bit of truth in it. Isn't it true that like most attacks of discouragement, there's a trace of truth from the enemy? When we feel attacked, these verbal assaults, they have a degree of truth in them. As builders, these Jewish builders, they are feeble. They're not going to complete this work in a day. They don't have the best materials to work with. Isn't it true that a lying, discouraging attack will often have some degree, some hint of truth in it, but it also neglects a greater truth that God is with us and God has promised to see us through. There's a degree of truth in what these men are saying, but it neglects the fact that God is with the Jewish people, helping them in their task. And what's so curious about this, Jesus said, if you have faith the size of a mustard seed. You remember this portion of scripture? Jesus, when he's teaching in the Gospels, he says, if you guys have faith the size of a mustard seed, you could tell this bush to uproot itself and go plant itself somewhere else. And I read that verse and I go, what size faith do I need then? Faith the size of a mustard seed, that's all I need? He says, if you have faith the size of a mustard seed, you could tell a mountain to get up and move. And I go, I want that kind of faith. I want that size of faith. And I think why Jesus says this, why he uses this figure of speech, is to show us it's not the size of your faith that counts, but who your faith is in. You could have even just a mustard seed size faith, but if it's in the right person, if it's in the right work, if it's in the right God who's called you to that work, then even a mustard seed sized faith is going to have an effect, right? Because God is with us. Sanballat and Tobiah sought to bring discouragement through criticism. And criticism is easy. Discouragement is such a powerful weapon because, well, what it does is it comes close to the opposite of faith. Where faith gets us to believe God and trust in him and his promises, discouragement attempts to shift our focus and believe the worst. Attempts to get us to forget about who God is, what he's promised to do. I mean, does anybody in the room struggle with discouragement? Anybody ever felt discouraged before or feel you're easily discouraged, or once you are discouraged, it's so hard to get refocused again? Sanballat and Tobiah, they want these workers not to focus on the God who's commissioned the work. They want these workers to focus on the work and how difficult it's going to be. And if they can get their focus on it, it serves to discourage them and it can shut the whole thing down. And the same is true of us. When we look at the holes in our lives, when we look at the things that need to be rebuilt, when we look at the impossibilities, we take our focus off of God and we look instead at the challenges, and it throws us all off course. Verse 3, Tobiah the Ammonite. Isn't there always a Tobiah, by the way? I mean, Sanballat's bad enough, but he's got a friend in this. Tobiah the Ammonite, who was at his side, said, what are they even building? Even a fox climbing up on it would break down their wall of stones, which is such a funny trash talk statement for 400 years before Christ, right? Even a fox jumping up on that might not strike you as being an insult. This is an insult. If a stiff breeze blew through there, that thing would fall, right? And he's joining in on the insult. Because isn't it true that, well, critics run with critics? They seem to find each other. Criticism, negativity, mockery, sarcasm, cynicism. It's easy, it's lazy, and it's contagious. And Tobiah and Sanballat, they deserve one another. Both critics, both cynics, both mockers, both hecklers. But notice the flaw in Tobiah's sentence. Did you see it? That ancient trash talk that doesn't strike us as trash talk, don't miss the flaw in his sentence. What they are building, even a fox climbing up on it would break down. Whose wall? Whose wall are they building? This is God's wall. This is God's work that they've been called to. This wasn't theirs. He was criticizing God's work. He was criticizing God's wall. I think one measure of a leader is to be able to measure criticism, not to allow oneself to be run down by the critical, but also being able to hear God's voice in the midst of criticism. And here, I think, is where we see this great character trait of Nehemiah. This is where we see a great character trait of this great leader. In the midst of persecution, in the midst of mockery, in the midst of heckling and insult and hardship, Nehemiah doesn't debate. He doesn't dialogue. He doesn't form a committee. He doesn't deal directly at all with these two enemies. Notice what he does. The scriptures don't even pause in the telling of this. He says, Tobiah the Ammonite, verse 3, who was at his side, said, what they are building, even a fox climbing up on it would break down their wall of stone. And then without even taking a breath, verse 4, hear us, O God, for we are despised. Did you catch it? Hear us, O God, for we are despised. Nehemiah doesn't respond to the hecklers. He doesn't respond to the mockers. He instead turns immediately to prayer, because for Nehemiah, prayer is a first resource, not a last resort. When times of opposition come, God wants us to rely on him, and the purest way of expressing our reliance on him is through prayer. And notice, too, that in his prayer, Nehemiah first asks for God's attention and mercy. He says, hear us, O God. Well, of course God hears you. Well, of course God notices. Well, of course God is paying attention. But Nehemiah needed to know not only that God was listening, I think what he's asking for is to be able to sense that God is listening. Isn't it that way with our prayers sometimes too? Like, God, I know you hear me. I need to feel that you hear me. Because I'm struggling. I'm hurting. I'm a little confused. I'm a little discouraged, and I need to sense your presence, O Lord, and your care. Hear us, O God. Hear me, God. Hear me, God. For I am despised. And then look at this prayer. This is a great prayer. Turn their insults back on their own heads. Like, woo, I didn't know you could pray that. Give them over as plunder and a land of captivity. It's like, tell me how you feel, Nehemiah. Don't cover their guilt or blot out their sins from their sight. This is heavy language. They have thrown insults in the face of the builders. Nehemiah asked God to fight his enemies for them. He goes to God. He depends on God to fight the battle. He goes, you take care of it. You gave me a work to do, and I don't want to get distracted, so you take care of it, right? I'm going to trust you and leave the consequences with you. And then he proceeds to issue this really rather severe prayer. Give them over as plunder. Don't cover up their guilt. Don't blot out their sins. And what's so funny is, like, as you explore the scriptures, you find that as severe as this prayer is, there's much worse in there. In the Psalms, in Psalm 58, verse 6, David asked God to break their teeth in their mouth, O Lord. I didn't know you could pray that. Break their teeth in their mouth, O Lord. And in another place, Psalm 69, the psalmist says, let their dwelling place be desolate. Let no one stay alive in their tents. We're like, woo. There's a psalm that ends with dashing their little ones' heads upon the rocks. That's a song they sang. I know. We should try that one at the end. What we learn in Scripture is that scriptures like these tell us it's proper for us as the children of God to pray such prayers, because it gives our violent inclinations over to God and lets him deal with them. You take it. I'm going to tell you, I'm not going to say it to them. I'm going to say it to you. And you may recall, and you may know this from history class, I read something about this recently, where Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War, well, they didn't know this about him until later. After his death, they found a box of notes and letters that he never sent. They were called burn letters and burn notes. During the Civil War, he would get so frustrated with some of his generals. One specifically, who had the opportunity to end the war if he had just advanced a little bit longer like he had been told to. But this man at the last minute turned and fled, and the war went on for years afterward, and Lincoln wanted to fire him. But he knew that if he did, he didn't have anyone to take his place. And so he sat down at a desk and wrote the most scathing letter of all the things he wanted to say. And then he locked it in a box that was framed with the title. It said, never to be sent. They found a pile of these letters after his death. It's a lot like that, isn't it? Like, I'm going to pray this up to God. The Psalms show us you can pray this up to God when you're feeling frustrated, when you're feeling angry. What we learn in Scripture is that we can pray these things to God. If we are angry with someone or have a real enemy, we deal with them in prayer. Never in the sense of praying evil upon them, perhaps, but in turning them over to a God who's just and he knows exactly what to do with them. And sometimes we don't. So we said in the first week of the series that you're building a wall too. You're rebuilding. You've been through some things, and now through God's strength, now that you've walked through fire, now that you've been through the valley, now that you've been through the purging, you too are rebuilding your life. And whatever your wall is, whether it's your family or your home or your self-image, your habits, your career, your marriage, your relationship with God, your parenting, it is a great work. You dare not come down. Like Nehemiah, you are writing the story of your life, and the story of your life is a great work. So write a good one, because you only get to write one. Write a story that you want to tell, or write the story you want told about you. Because some of you are writing a story for someone else. And what story do you want told? In the second week, we asked, what breaks your heart? The way Nehemiah identified what he was called to build was identified when he felt his heart break. And then after that, we said, examine your wall. Where are the holes? Where are the places? Where are the breaches? Where are the things that you need to spend some time on and some energy on? We said this isn't going to happen in a day. Do you remember? We said that you can't pray your way out of a mess that you behaved your way into. This will take work, which means there will be discouragement. There will be opposition. There will be times of despair, and there will be haters. So let's deal with the discouragement first. There's a trace of truth in words of discouragement. These attacks and verbal assaults have truth in them. It's as if when you feel it, it's as if, doesn't it feel sometimes like that voice of attack? It feels a bit like there's an animated force behind it, right? Like when these voices or these accusations or these memories or these things that you're hit with, it's like, for you, you might not have an actual Tobiah. You might not have an actual Sanballat, but those voices feel real, as if there's someone behind them, as if there's a malevolent force back there behind the voices, behind the whisper. And some of us go, I don't have a Sanballat, I don't have a Tobiah per se, but I do struggle with feelings of discouragement that seem personified. The thing is, those voices don't lie all the way. They say true things. They remind us of how things were. They point out where we've been, what we've lost, how much we've failed, how futile this all feels, how much there is still left to go. They're not untruths. They're just half-truths. They neglect something. That God's with you. And that he's called you. And that he's promised to see you through. So when that voice of discouragement comes and seeks to make you focus on what's been lost, we're to remind ourselves, yeah, but Jesus is with us. I mean, that's what's happening in this story. Yes, the Jews were feeble. Yes, they had subpar materials to work with. Yes, it was going to take a long time. Yes, it all seemed futile. But this is God's wall. And God's called them to build it. And discouragement, it just gets us to focus on what's been lost rather than who's with me in the rebuild. See, there's this myth, this ancient legend where some sources say that her name was Berenice. Still others say her name was Veronica. And legend was that outside of her door was a statue of her bowing to the person of Jesus. And then from the base of the statue, from the foot of it, a strange flower grew that was said to heal diseases. And this is lore, of course, but either way, it all traced back to that day. That day in the crowded streets, the day in the busy roads, that day with the throngs and the mass of people who so maniacally pushed in against that Messiah. She lived this way for 12 years. 12 years of suffering, 12 years of bleedings, 12 years of social isolation, 12 years of physical isolation, 12 years of religious isolation, 12 years of being told day after day, you're unclean. You can't come into contact with anybody. 12 years that if she was married, would have cost her her marriage. 12 years of being told you're worth divorcing. 12 years of if she wasn't married, 12 years of realizing she'd never have the prospect of being married because what she was disordered with would cost her being connected to anyone. And all in one moment, taking all of the risk under the penalty of Jewish law. You remember the story? She musters the courage in that busy crowd to reach for the hem of his garment. Somehow she fought past and pushed back the heavy congestion. She broke past the entourage that sought to keep Jesus safe. And somehow in that moment, she's able to clasp the hem of his garment. And the scriptures say that in that moment, he immediately felt his power leave him. And he turned. And in that busy street, in that busy crowd, he asked a question that seems so silly and so strange. Who touched me? And the disciples all laugh. Are you serious? He's being serious right now. Jesus, there's hundreds of people pushed in around you. Who touched you? And he goes, I felt my power leave me. Who touched me? Can you imagine being her? For 12 years, you've been told not to touch anybody. For 12 years, you've been cut off from society. For 12 years, you've been isolated. For 12 years, you've been told you're unclean. And in one moment, you take all that risk and you reach out. And in that moment, you feel, you are stunned by your instant cleansing, and yet still somehow broken and ashamed because the risk you took is now being called out in front of everybody. Everybody has stopped. Everyone's looking at you as you're shocked from your cleansing and scared of the question. And she has no choice but to confess. And I love what Mark says next. Then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet, trembling with fear. She was scared to death. She's afraid. She knew that according to Jewish law, what she had done was wrong. If she'd been found out, she'd be in big trouble. She's trembling with fear. She's shaking like a leaf. And so Mark says she told him the whole truth. And do you remember what Jesus does? There in the midst of that clanging crowd, do you remember what Jesus says to her? He drops to a knee, eyeball to eyeball with her, says, hey, look up here, look up here. And do you remember what he called her? Daughter. She hadn't been called that in years. Daughter. There's no record of Jesus ever using this word anywhere else in the Gospels. Daughter. Jesus never called any other person by that name. Daughter. It's as if Jesus stopped time, stopped the caravan, stopped the crowd because he wanted them to hear, he wanted her to hear this special name of tenderness, daughter. And you remember what he says next? Your faith has healed you. My faith? No. The hem of your garment healed me. Your robe healed me. Like when I touched it was like, and I immediately was healed. Your faith healed you. See, if Jesus didn't stop to make this point, if he didn't stop to call this out, if he didn't stop to make this special concession, then she would go on thinking that a cloth had healed her. She would go on thinking she had stolen a blessing. Daughter, he says, it wasn't my garment that healed you. It wasn't my robe. It wasn't the hem. It was your faith. It's as if Jesus wanted her to know, Jesus wanted us to know that it isn't the size of your challenge. It isn't the size of your opposition, the size of your adversity. It isn't the size of the struggle that should be in focus. For him, it wasn't the hem of his robe. It's our faith. And who we put our faith in is way more important than the size of our foe. Who we put our faith in is way more important than what we're rebuilding. Yes, the rebuild is challenging. Yes, the new life is hard. Yes, there's lots of holes in the wall, and sometimes our effort seems futile. And yes, there's so many Tobiahs. I wish there wasn't. There's so many Sanballats, all there to point out what's wrong, where we've fallen short, all that stands in the way, all that's laughable. But there's a God who's in it with us too. Focus instead on him. Focus instead on him. Hey, daughter, eyes up here, daughter. Focus instead on him. Just a few minutes after this interruption, they begin moving again, but the interruption in the street would cost him the life of his daughter because Jairus had gone there in the first place to get the Messiah and to bring him back to his 12-year-old girl who was tucked away with the fever, inches from death. He was on his way to heal her when the woman interrupted him. He was on his way to heal her. And now in that passage of time, it had cost her her life. As servants ran up to Jairus, as the scene picks up, servants run up to Jairus and say, Master, it's too late. There's no need to bother the teacher anymore. Your little girl is dead. And his world begins to spin. His knees buckle beneath him. His heart breaks in half. His head sank. And in that moment, he catches eyes with Jesus. And do you remember what Jesus says again? Do not fear, only believe. Do not fear, only believe. Do not fear, only believe. Jairus has a choice to make. Am I going to put my faith in my circumstances? Am I going to put my faith in the truth of my circumstances? Jesus goes, eyes up here, Jairus. Just have faith. Only believe. Hey, don't look down here. Eyes up here. Just have faith. Only believe. I know you want to focus on the negative. Eyes up here, Jairus. Just have faith. Only believe. You have that same choice. As the story picks up, Jesus makes his way down those dirt roads and into an adobe hut with a dirt floor. And with his back pressed up against that wall, holding this cold little girl's hand, he says the words that bring her back to life. Talitha kume. Air comes back into her lungs. Everyone applauds. And he looks around, and with all the compassion, all the care in the world, he says, get her something to eat. She's probably hungry. And don't tell anybody about this, because she's 12. She's got prom ahead of her, and ain't nobody going to want to dance with a corpse. Doesn't discouragement seek to suffocate the faith we have shown? Doesn't discouragement seek to suffocate the hope that we've put in Jesus? Doesn't discouragement seek to get us to question what we're doing? It gets us to focus on ourselves and how futile our efforts are. It's so narrow and self-focused on our own lives when we begin to shift our focus back to ourselves, and our hearts get exposed and compromised, full of holes and cracks like the wall we're seeking to rebuild. Discouragement seeks to remove the faith we've shown in the first place and to begin to focus instead on ourselves. But guys, remember who your faith is in. Remember who your faith is in. Eyes up here. Just have faith. Do not fear. Only believe. Remember who your faith is in. Remember who's rebuilding with you. Don't stare at what's been lost. Remind yourself of who joins you. So there's discouragement, and then there's haters. There will always be haters. There will always be Sanballats. There will always be Tobiahs, liars and thieves who will steal from you, who will shut down the work that you are doing, which is what makes the art of this over-under reaction so compelling. Nehemiah doesn't turn and jeer at them. He doesn't argue with them. He doesn't shout at them. He doesn't fight back. He instead just simply prays. It's an over-under reaction. He just prays. He turns his attention to God, and he stays focused. I don't need their approval. God, I got yours. I'm going to keep working. Remember in Galatians chapter 1, verse 10, Paul says, am I now trying to win the approval of people or of God? Which is a great question, isn't it? Are you trying to win the approval of people or of God? Notice the dichotomy there that Paul sets up. He says you can have one or the other, but you can't have both. You can either have people-pleasing or you can have God-pleasing, right? And the extent to which you chase the one is the extent to which you move away from the other. So which are you going to choose? Am I now trying to win the approval of people or of God? Am I trying to please people? Paul goes on to ask. If I were still trying to please people, I would not be a servant of Jesus. The extent to which you're free of what people think is the extent to which Paul says you can be a servant of Jesus. Are you trying to please people or are you trying to please God? Nehemiah chooses God. You can have one or the other. Nehemiah chooses God. He stays focused upon God. And at the sound of their taunts, he simply turns to him, underreacting in prayer. Shouldn't that be our stance? In everything in our lives, every challenge, every fear, every anxiety, to just underreact. Like, God, you got this. You believe you have the sovereign God of the universe as your friend, right? You believe you have a phone line to the sovereign God of the universe who knows your name and wants to hear from. Why do we get worked up about anything? So Nehemiah just casually turns to God. You believe your eternity is all worked out. We should be the most confident, most cool-headed people in every room that we're in. We believe God knows our names. We should be confident. We should be able to just withstand anything. We're a son or a daughter of the King. Regardless of where we live or what we have, there's a confidence that comes with that. You should be the most confident person in the room, which is what bugs me when I hear Christians freaking out about things like science. We shouldn't be afraid of science. There's no threat from science. I think every time science comes out or rolls out some new discovery, I think every Christian should go, oh, so that's how he did it. That's how he did it. That's how that works. That's how he designed it. You believe God is in control of the universe. I hear Christians getting worked up about Tuesday. Like the world's going to end if this doesn't go a certain way, or and I hear this kind of talk out there sometimes, and it's like, do you believe God's in control? Or Washington? We should be the coolest people. We shouldn't be threatened by science. Good grief. We shouldn't be threatened by politics. You believe the eternal sovereign God of the heavens knows your name. Then what are you worried about? We just simply turn to him in prayer. Nehemiah believed this. And so the underreaction there to all this going on around him is to just go, could you deal with this so I can stay focused? And look what happens as a result. Nehemiah doesn't need to lash out or freak out. He doesn't need to panic or worry. He just needed to talk to God about it and let him deal with it. And he does, not by changing Sanballat or Tobiah's hearts, but by changing the people's hearts. Verse 6, so we rebuilt the wall till all of it reached half its height, halfway done. For the people worked, and look at that last phrase, with all their heart. So God answers Nehemiah's prayer by giving the people a heart to work, which is exactly what the enemy was trying to shut down, to remove their motivation, to remove their heart to work. He was trying to destroy with his attacks by making them feel defeated or passive or self-focused or discouraged. The immediate answer to Nehemiah's prayer did not change his enemies, though. Notice that. The enemies don't change. Nehemiah's prayer asked God to take care of his enemies. God answered by taking care of his people. We often miss God's answers to prayer because we want God to take care of other people. What God often offers to do is something in us. And that's what he does here. Is it done yet? No. Is it only halfway? Yeah. But the people worked with all their heart because Nehemiah simply turned to God in prayer. So if our reactions speak louder than our words, what do our reactions say about us? Do we believe God's in control? Do we believe we have a direct line to heaven? Why don't we use it more? What if we grew in that area of our reactions? Opposition, wouldn't it just become an opportunity? Opposition would be opportunity to display and reveal that our hope and our faith is in God, that we really believe he knows our names, that we really believe he cares, that we really believe he is with us, and our faith is in him, even if only a mustard seed size. Your faith has healed you. So, Lord Jesus, I pray over all of us that we could be a bit more like Nehemiah, so trusting of you at all times. It gets so scary out there. And there's no shortage of hecklers, no shortage of haters. And sometimes it can feel like that discouragement is animated and malevolent and looking for us. And we're going to head out from this place back into a world full of Tobiahs and Sanballats and discouragement. And I pray over each of us. I pray over me. That we can remember whose we are. And that our first resource would be to return to you in prayer and to stay focused, to turn to you as the object of our faith. Would you give us faith enough to do that? Would you give us just a mustard seed? That's all it would take. Friends, as we close, Pastor Jay, I asked him if he would lead us in sort of a reflection time as we seek to ready ourselves for this week, as we seek to ready ourselves for the adventure, leaving here. We've tasted the food, and now we want to digest it. So, Spirit, have your way in this room.
Thank you again for joining us online. We hope you enjoyed the message. To connect with us, you can follow us on Instagram or Facebook. For more information on who we are, check out our website, midtownvineyardchurch.com. We'd love to hear from you. Make sure you leave us a review or drop us a comment. Until next time, have a great day.